He built his empire on fear and silence. She arrived in Seoul carrying a secret that would get her killed. The night their worlds collided, nothing, not his power, not her past, would ever be the same. Hit that like button right now if you're already hooked. Drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Follow all the way to the end. You will not see the final scene coming. The elevator opened directly onto the rooftop, and the first thing Kwon Tae-hyun noticed when he stepped out was that everyone in the room adjusted. Not dramatically, not with any movement that would be visible on a security recording, but the air changed, the way it always changed when he entered a space, with that particular invisible tightening that happened when people who understood consequence recognized that consequence had just walked in. He was used to it. He'd been producing that effect since he was 22 years old, and he was 34 now. And somewhere in the 12 years between those 2 points, he had stopped registering it as anything other than information. People tightened around him. That was data. That data was useful. That was all. The Shin Group rooftop occupied the 52nd floor of the Shin Tower in Gangnam, and it had been designed by an architect who charged more per square meter than most people earned in a year. Glass walls on 3 sides, imported stone underfoot, heating coils embedded in the floor so that the outdoor terrace felt temperate even in November, which it was. Early November, cold enough that the city below was hard-edged and bright, all contrast and no softness. The catering staff moved through the crowd in white shirts and black aprons. The guests wore clothing that had been selected, in most cases, specifically for the purpose of communicating wealth without appearing to try, which was itself an art form that required significant wealth to practice convincingly. Tae-hyun wore a charcoal suit that his tailor had finished 2 days ago, and that fit him with the kind of precision that made other men's suits look like approximations. He wore it the way he wore most things, without apparent awareness that he was wearing it at all. He moved through the room the way water moved through a landscape, finding the path of least resistance, which in his case meant the path farthest from anyone who wanted something from him, which tonight meant the northeast corner of the terrace, near the glass railing, where the view was best and the density of people was lowest. Park Jisoo fell in beside him without being asked. Jisoo always fell in beside him. It was one of the man's better qualities. His ability to materialize precisely when needed and vanish precisely when not needed, like a well-calibrated instrument. They had grown up in adjacent neighborhoods in Mapo, had spent their adolescences running the same streets, had entered Tae-hyun's father's organization within 6 months of each other, and had survived the years since through a combination of competence and mutual ruthlessness that neither of them would have described in those terms, but both of them understood completely. Shin Kyung-ho is going to try to put you at his table for dinner, Jisoo said. His voice was always low, always level, a voice engineered for conversations that shouldn't carry. No. He's the host. He's also 3 months behind on the Apgujeong arrangement, and he knows I know it. He wants a dinner table conversation so he can make the numbers sound different than they are. Taehyun reached the railing and stopped, looking out at the city. Tell Suhan to put me at the east table, near the exit. Done. Jisoo paused. Cho Byung-soo is here. Something shifted slightly in Tae-hyun's expression, though a person who didn't know him well would not have been able to identify what shifted or in which direction. Where? Bar. He's been there since before we arrived. He's had 4 drinks. He's nervous. He should be nervous. Tae-hyun said nothing. Below him, on the service terrace that ran along the building's 48th floor, accessible from the main event by a secondary stairwell, used exclusively by catering staff, he could see the white-shirted figures moving with the practiced efficiency of people who had done this work long enough that it required no conscious attention. Trays up, trays down. Glasses collected, glasses distributed. The choreography of service. He watched it without a particular interest. It was the city that held his attention. The specific way Seoul looked from this height and this angle on a cold November night, all compressed light and vertical ambition, every tower a statement about someone's certainty that more was always available if you were willing to reach far enough and hard enough, and without sufficient concern for who got displaced in the reaching. He had spent his entire adult life inside that logic. He understood it at a cellular level. Then the tray went over. He saw it happen from 52 floors up. One of the service carts on the lower terrace shifting suddenly, bumped from the other side by a colleague who hadn't seen it. And the young woman carrying the champagne tray was mid-step when it happened. No time to adjust. And the tray tilted, and then there was nothing. Just the slow, inevitable cascade of glass and liquid. And the particular kind of silence that follows a loud accident in a space where everyone nearby freezes simultaneously. She stood perfectly still in the aftermath, soaked down the front of her white shirt, empty tray hanging from one hand, the mess spreading around her feet in a glittering radius. And then she looked up, not at the colleagues already rushing toward her, not at the supervisor who was going to have something to say about this. She looked up at the open sky, at the narrow black strip of it visible from where she stood, between buildings, between the lit geometry of Seoul's skyline. And her expression did something that Tae-hyun, even from this distance, even at this height, registered with complete clarity. She smiled, not a performance smile, not the manufactured composure of someone managing a professional disaster. Something quieter and more private than that. The smile of a person who had found something genuinely funny about their own situation, who was choosing, in a moment that deserved frustration and probably warranted a small spiral, to simply note the absurdity and let it sit there without fighting it. It was directed at no one. It served no social function. It existed purely because it was the honest expression of what she actually felt. Tae-hyun's hand tightened on the railing. He did not move for approximately 45 seconds. He was aware of this afterward, in the way that you become aware of having stopped breathing when you suddenly start again. He stood at the railing and watched her crouch down and begin collecting the fallen glasses. Methodical, unhurried, speaking to the colleague who'd moved in to help. Saying something that made the colleague laugh even as they both knelt on a wet terrace floor, picking up broken glass at an event where the guests upstairs were drinking champagne that cost more per bottle than either of them earned in a week. "Sir." He turned. Kim Soo-han was standing 3 feet behind him. Mid-30s, former military police, currently the most reliable member of Tae-hyun's personal security rotation, with the particular neutral expression that meant something required attention without being an emergency. Cho Byung-soo has moved toward the East Lounge. He's the woman on the lower terrace, Tae-hyun said. White shirt. She dropped the tray 2 minutes ago. Soo-han moved to the railing, looked down, looked back, said nothing. "I want her name," begged. Her name was Amara Johnson. Soo-han had it in 9 minutes. 26 years old, American national from Atlanta, Georgia. 8 months in Seoul on a standard working visa. Employed by Hwang Catering, one of the Shin Group's 3 regular contractors. Previous employment included 2 other catering companies and a restaurant in Itaewon where she had worked for the first 4 months after her arrival. No significant online presence, an Instagram account with fewer than 200 followers. Mostly photographs of street scenes and occasionally small paintings that she had apparently made herself. No notable personal or professional associations in Seoul's social ecosystem. Background as clean as backgrounds got, when they were clean because nothing interesting had ever happened, rather than clean because someone had made the interesting things disappear. Tae-hyun received this information while standing in the East Lounge listening to Cho Byung-soo explain his Incheon acquisition strategy with the energetic desperation of a man who understood that he was explaining himself and couldn't stop. Byung-soo was 41, recently elevated to managing the syndicate's port operations, and had overstepped 3 weeks ago by bidding on a warehouse district in Tae-hyun's designated territory without clearing it first. The bid had been successful, which meant the conversation they were currently having was about something more layered than a simple mistake. "The timing was difficult," Byung-soo was saying. "The window opened faster than expected, and I made a judgment call." "You made a call," Tae-hyun said. "The judgment part is what we're discussing." Byung-soo's jaw tightened slightly. He was a large man, broad through the chest, with the kind of physical confidence that came from decades of being the biggest presence in most rooms. But he had been shrinking incrementally throughout this conversation in a way he probably wasn't aware of. It was a 6-hour window. There was no time to... There's always time to make one phone call. Taehyun's voice was completely even. That was the thing about how he spoke when he was actually serious. The evenness wasn't performed calm. It was the absence of any felt need to perform anything at all. The warehouse district sits on the Mapo corridor. The Mapo corridor has been my family's territory for 19 years. You know this. I know you know this because I explained it to you personally when you moved into the port role. Byung-soo said nothing. So the question isn't whether you knew. The question is what you thought was going to happen afterward. Taehyun let that sit for a moment. What did you think was going to happen, Byung-soo? I thought... He stopped. Started again. I thought the acquisition made strategic sense and that you'd see that. I do see that. The acquisition makes reasonable strategic sense. Taehyun picked up his whiskey glass, considered it, set it back down. That's not the issue. The issue is that you decided to go ahead based on your own assessment of my likely response, instead of asking me. Do you understand the difference between those two things? A long pause. Yes. 30% of the warehouse revenue comes to me for the first 18 months. After that, we'll renegotiate based on performance. Taehyun turned slightly, signaling that the conversation was finished. And next time there's a 6-hour window, you use 4 of those hours to make the phone call. Byung-soo left. Jisoo appeared from somewhere to Taehyun's left, with the subtle timing that had always been one of his most useful qualities. How'd that go? He'll be fine. He was testing the boundary. Now he knows where it is. Taehyun glanced toward the terrace. The Johnson woman. Is she still on shift? Jisoo blinked, a minimal reaction, but notable, because Jisoo almost never blinked at unexpected information. Hwang's crew is scheduled through midnight. I want to speak with her. A pause that lasted exactly 1 second longer than a purely logistical pause would have. She's a catering employee, Taehyun. I'm aware of what she is. Half the women in this room have been engineering reasons to speak with you for the last 2 hours. I know. Taehyun straightened his jacket. Which is why I'm not interested in speaking with them. They brought her up via the secondary stairwell at 9:47 p.m., which was the kind of thing that, when it happened to you while you were a 26-year-old catering employee in a borrowed city working a function you'd been assigned 48 hours ago, produced a very specific species of terror. Amara Johnson stood in the corridor outside the East Lounge with her hands clasped in front of her, and her damp shirt still faintly visible through her jacket. The supervisor had loaned her a catering blazer after the spill, dark navy, slightly too large, and she was running through every possible reason that a senior staff member would pull her from her station and bring her upstairs and tell her, with a carefully neutral expression, that someone wanted to speak with her. None of the reasons she could generate were good. She was not, by nature, a person who expected good surprises. She had grown up in a house where surprises mostly meant that something had shifted in a direction that required rapid adjustment, and 8 months in Seoul had done nothing to recalibrate that particular reflex. Seoul was beautiful and alien, and occasionally overwhelming in the way that beautiful alien things were overwhelming, and she had built a cautious, careful life here. Her apartment in Mapo, her catering shifts, her sketchbooks, the small paintings she made on weekend mornings when the light through her east-facing window was good and the street below was still quiet. It was not an ambitious life. It was a survivable one, which was what she'd needed when she arrived, and was still mostly what she needed now. The door opened. The man who was apparently waiting to speak with her was sitting in an armchair near the window with the easy stillness of someone who had never in their life sat anywhere and felt like they didn't belong there. He was looking at her when she came in, not the way men usually looked at her in situations like this, with the particular combination of assessment and entitlement that she had learned to recognize and brace for, but with a directness that was somehow less aggressive than that while being considerably more unnerving. Like he was simply observing a fact. "Sit down," he said. In English, which surprised her enough that she paused a beat before moving toward the chair across from him. "I don't..." She stopped. Started again. Her voice came out lower than she intended, which happened sometimes when she was nervous. "Am I in trouble?" Something moved across his face. Not quite amusement. Something adjacent to it. "Why would you be in trouble?" "Would. Because I dropped a tray of champagne worth probably more than my monthly salary, and now someone I've never met is asking to speak with me in a private room." He looked at her for a moment. "That's a reasonable concern," he said. "No, you're not in trouble." She sat. The chair was the kind of expensive that you felt through the back of your legs, the specific density of quality materials, and she had a sudden, vivid awareness of her navy catering blazer and her still slightly damp shirt, and the fact that she had a small cut on her left palm from one of the glass shards that she hadn't had time to properly address. "My name is Kwon Tae-hyun," he said. She nodded slowly. She didn't recognize the name, which she would later understand was an indicator of how carefully she had been navigating the surface of Seoul without engaging with its deeper architecture. If she had been more networked, more socially embedded in the city's upper registers, she would have recognized the name the way you recognized a weather system, by its reputation for damage. "Amara Johnson," she said. "I know." He paused. "You've been in Seoul 8 months. How do you know that?" "It's easy to find out." She looked at him. I don't know if that's reassuring or not." "It's not meant to be reassuring. It's meant to be accurate." He picked up his glass, then set it down again without drinking. "You were looking at the sky, after the tray." She went very still. "What?" "When the tray went over. You stood there for a moment, and then you looked up at the sky." He watched her face. "I was on the terrace above. I could see you." Amara was quiet for a moment. There was something strange happening in her chest. Not fear exactly, though fear was present, sitting in the back of it like a bass note, but something more complicated than fear, something that didn't have a name she could reach for quickly. Being seen, she thought. That was part of it. Being seen doing something private that you didn't know anyone was watching. "It seemed like the right thing to look at," she said finally. "Why?" "Because everything down here was broken. So." She looked at her hands. "I looked somewhere that wasn't." He said nothing for a moment. She looked up and found him watching her with an expression she couldn't read, not because it was complex, but because it was still in a way that faces usually weren't, like whatever he was thinking was happening at a depth that the surface wasn't reporting. "What do you paint?" he said. She blinked. "How do you know I paint?" "Your Instagram. The photographs you post are compositionally interesting. The paintings more so." He paused. "You haven't posted one in 6 weeks." "You looked at my Instagram." "Yes." "Why?" "Because I wanted to know who you were." He said it without any quality of apology or seduction, as simply as stating the square footage of a property. "What do you paint?" She studied him for a moment. This was, objectively, a strange situation. She was in a private room at an event she was working as a waitress with a man whose name she didn't recognize and who had apparently spent the last hour learning about her from her sparse internet presence. And the correct response to this situation probably involved standing up and excusing herself professionally and returning to her station. She was aware of this. She was also aware that he was asking about her painting with the specific quality of attention, the kind that didn't deflect or soften or redirect, that just waited for the answer, that she almost never encountered, and that she was, despite every reasonable instinct telling her to be guarded, answering him. "People," she said. "Mostly. Faces. Sometimes city scenes, but I'm more interested in faces." "Why faces?" "Because they're the hardest thing to get right. You can paint a building wrong, and no one can tell you with certainty that you're wrong, because buildings don't have feelings about how they're rendered. Faces do." She paused, surprised by her own specificity. She didn't usually talk about this. "People know when their face has been painted by someone who actually looked at them versus someone who painted a version of what they expected to see. There's a difference, and you can always feel it." He looked at her. "Yes," he said. "There is." The quality of silence that followed was not comfortable exactly, but it was not uncomfortable in the way that silence usually was, that pressurized blankness that demanded filling. It was something else, a held breath, an orbit. "Why Seoul?" he said. She looked at the window. Through it, the city spread in every direction, magnificent and indifferent. "I needed somewhere that wasn't Atlanta." "That's not an answer. It's the truest one I have right now." She met his eyes. "We just met." Something shifted in his expression. Not softening exactly. The word softening implied a default hardness that was giving way, and what she observed was different from that, was less a structural change than an adjustment in frequency, like a signal sharpening. "Fair," he said. She was back on her station by 10:15. The rest of the shift moved in its normal rhythm, trays and glasses, and the practiced invisibility of service work, the way your body learned to be functional and present without your mind needing to fully engage, the particular autopilot that got you through long nights at events like this one. She smiled at guests when they addressed her. She navigated the terrace without dropping anything else. She was, by every external measure, simply doing her job. Inside, she was somewhere else entirely. She had been in Seoul for 8 months, and in that time she had kept her world carefully small. It was a deliberate smallness, the smallness of a person managing exposure, rationing risk. She had her apartment, her shifts, her sketchbooks. She had a couple of coworkers she liked well enough to get ramen with occasionally. She called her mother in Atlanta on Sunday afternoons. She had constructed a version of daily life that asked almost nothing of her, and offered, in exchange, the specific relief of days that passed without incident. She had built this life for a reason that she did not think about directly, but that informed every decision she made, the way a foundation informed a building. Invisible from the outside, structurally essential, the thing that everything else rested on without acknowledging. Her father had been dead for 2 years. His debts were not. She knew this the way she knew her own heartbeat, constantly, without having to check. The debt existed. It had a number attached to it that was so far outside anything she could address that she had stopped relating to it as a number and started relating to it as a condition, like weather, like geography, like a permanent feature of her landscape that she simply navigated around. She had left Atlanta because staying had started to feel like standing still in a place where something was moving toward you. Seoul was distance, Seoul was time. Seoul was the hope, which she held as loosely as she could manage, that distance plus time might equal something. She had told no one about this. She had no intention of telling anyone about this. The shift ended at midnight. She collected her jacket and her bag from the staff room and took the service elevator down to street level and stepped out into November Seoul with the cold immediately finding her face and the noise of the city already receding behind the glass towers as she walked toward the subway entrance. She was 2 blocks from the Shin Tower when she noticed the car. Black, mid-size, parked against the curb with its engine running and its lights off. Not unusual on its own, but it had been parked in the same position when she'd arrived at 6 p.m. She remembered it because it had been blocking the sidewalk slightly and she'd had to step around it. And it was still here now, and the engine was still running. And when she walked past it, the 2 men in the front didn't look at her. People who weren't watching you didn't actively look away when you walked past. She kept her pace even, kept her face forward, turned the corner and walked faster and didn't look back and told herself it was nothing. Told herself the version of herself that had spent 2 years flinching at shadows was overreacting again, reading threat into coincidence, finding patterns in noise. She almost believed it. She was underground on the platform waiting for the train when her phone buzzed. Unknown number. Korean country code, but not a number she had saved. She stared at it for 3 seconds. The train was coming. She could feel it in the soles of her feet before she heard it, that subsonic vibration that preceded arrival. She answered, "Miss Johnson." The voice was male, middle-aged, speaking accented English with the flat effect of someone who had learned the language for functional rather than social purposes. "We've been trying to reach you for some time. My employer has been very patient." The train arrived, the doors opened. People moved around her. She didn't board. "Who is this?" she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that distantly. That her voice was steady while her hand was not. Someone who represents an outstanding balance. A brief pause. "Your father's balance, Miss Johnson. I think you know what I'm referring to." The doors closed, the train left, the platform emptied. Amara stood alone on the concrete with the phone pressed to her ear and the cold air from the tunnel moving around her and the voice on the other end of the line waiting, with all the patience of something that had always known it would eventually find her, for her to say something back. She had run 8,000 miles, and it had found her anyway. And tomorrow night, at the restaurant where she worked the dinner shift, she was going to have to figure out what to do about a man named Kwon Tae-hyun, who had looked at her like she was the only real thing in a room full of performances, and who she could not, under any circumstances, allow to get close enough to become collateral in a war she had never chosen to fight. She stood on the empty platform and breathed. The phone was still in her hand. The voice was still waiting. She answered the call. That was the first mistake. Or maybe it wasn't a mistake at all. Maybe it was the thing that had been inevitable since the moment her father had sat across from men whose names she would never learn, and borrowed money she would never see, and signed something she would never read. And the only question that had ever existed was not whether this call would come, but when, and from how far away. "I think," she said, "you have the wrong number." A pause. Brief, patient, the kind of pause that communicated that this was not the first time someone had tried that, and it was not going to be the last, and it had never once worked. "Miss Johnson, Amara, your father's name was David Johnson. He passed away 22 months ago in Atlanta, Georgia. Before he died, he borrowed a considerable sum from an organization my employer represents. The principal amount was $400,000. With accrued interest and administrative fees, the current balance is $1.3 million. Another pause. This is not the wrong number. The platform was empty. The tunnel air moved around her in slow, pressureless waves. Somewhere above her soul was doing what soul always did, grinding forward, spectacular and indifferent. And down here she was standing under fluorescent light with a number in her ear that had no relationship to anything in her actual life. $1.3 million. "My father is dead," she said. "Yes, we're aware." "Then the debt died with him." That would be a very convenient interpretation. The voice remained flat, instructional, the tone of someone explaining something they had explained before. "Unfortunately, that is not how my employer's arrangements work. Your father was made aware at the time of borrowing that the obligation was familial in nature. There is documentation to this effect." "I never signed anything." "Your father signed on behalf of the family. Under the terms of the agreement, that signature covers immediate dependence. A slight shift, not warmth, but something that wanted to perform the suggestion of reasonableness." "We are not unreasonable people, Miss Johnson. We have given you nearly 2 years. We located you in Seoul approximately 5 weeks ago, and we have been patient. We are simply asking for a conversation." "A conversation," she repeated. "A meeting to discuss options. My employer understands your current financial situation and is prepared to discuss alternative arrangements." The slightest emphasis on the word alternative, just enough to make it land wrong. "We would like to meet tomorrow evening. There is a restaurant in Mapo, Cheongdam Grill, 8 o'clock. She said nothing. "If you don't come," the voice said, still flat, still patient, "we will come to your workplace instead. We know your schedule, Miss Johnson. We have known it for 5 weeks." The not-quite warmth evaporated entirely. "It would be better for everyone if this were handled privately." The line went dead. Amara lowered the phone, looked at it, put it in her pocket. The next train came in 4 minutes, and she got on it and rode it 6 stops to Mapo, and walked the 7 minutes to her building, and climbed the stairs to her 3rd-floor apartment, and sat on her kitchen floor with her back against the cabinet and her knees pulled up and stayed there for a long time without moving. She did not call anyone. There was no one to call. Her mother was in Atlanta working a double shift at the hospital where she'd worked for 19 years, and calling her would accomplish nothing except transferring panic across an ocean in a direction that would only make things worse. She had no friends in Seoul who existed outside the careful surface level she had constructed. People who knew her name and her work schedule, and not one thing more, because she had engineered it that way, because she had understood from the moment she bought her one-way ticket that proximity to her was a liability. She thought about Kwon Tae-hyun. She did not want to think about Kwon Tae-hyun, but the mind went where it went. And it went to the private room in the East Lounge and his eyes and the particular quality of his attention, and she pressed the heels of her hands against her eye sockets until she saw color and thought, no, no, absolutely not. Whatever that was, whatever had happened in that room that she couldn't entirely name, it ended here, tonight, on this kitchen floor. She would not contact him. She would not let this touch him. She would figure this out herself the way she had been figuring things out herself since she was old enough to understand that her father's version of protection was its own species of danger. She stayed on the floor until her legs went numb. Then she got up, made tea she didn't drink, and spent the rest of the night sitting at her small table by the window, watching the street below and thinking about the black car with the running engine and the men who had not looked at her. At 7 the next morning, her phone buzzed again. Unknown number. Different from last night's. Korean country code. She stared at it for 2 rings. Then, against everything, she answered. "You look tired." Kwon Tae-hyun's voice was exactly as she remembered it, even unhurried, with that quality of someone who never raised volume because they never needed to. Did you sleep? She closed her eyes. How did you get this number? The same way I found out everything else. That's not an answer. It's an accurate one. A brief pause. You didn't board the 12:14 train. You stood on the platform after it left, and then you boarded the 12:31 instead. You were on your phone. The coldness that moved through her was not entirely fear. Part of it was the specific sensation of realizing that the walls of the careful, small life she had built were less solid than she had believed. Are you having me followed? I had someone confirm you got home safely. There's a difference. I'm not sure there is. Amara. He said her name the way people said things they had already decided. Something happened last night. She stood up from the table, walked to the window. Outside, Mappo was waking up in its usual way. The Pojangmacha owner unfolding his cart, two school children in identical coats moving fast against the cold, a delivery driver arguing with his phone. The street was completely ordinary. And somewhere in it, there were people who had been watching her for 5 weeks. Nothing happened, she said. You're a bad liar. You don't know that. You met me for 20 minutes. 15. And you told me that people know when a face has been painted by someone who actually looked at them. Another pause. I'm looking at you, Amara. Something happened. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass. Outside, the Pojangmacha owner lit his first burner of the morning, and the smell of it, even through the window, was something she would later associate with this specific moment, this exact second of standing on a ledge between two versions of what happened next. I have to work tonight, she said. I have a dinner shift. I know. There's something I need to handle, on my own. Okay. She waited for him to push. He didn't push. He simply waited, and the waiting was somehow more destabilizing than pushing would have been, because she had spent years bracing against pressure and had almost no defenses against the absence of it. Don't send anyone to watch me, she said. I mean it. A beat. I'll consider it. It's the most honest answer I can give you. His voice was the same temperature it always was, which was the temperature of rooms that had been deliberately climate-controlled. If you're in trouble, Amara, I'd rather know. You don't know me. No, but I'd like to. He paused. That's also an honest answer. She didn't respond to that. Couldn't, exactly. It landed in a place she didn't have ready language for, in the part of her that had been closed for so long that she'd stopped thinking of it as closed and started thinking of it as just the shape of things. Don't call this number again, she said, and hung up. She stood at the window for another 10 minutes. Then she got dressed, picked up her sketchbook because her hands needed something to do, and spent the morning drawing faces she'd seen on the subway. The architecture of strangers, which had always been easier than the architecture of people who might matter. Madam. She went to Cheongdam Grill at 8 o'clock. She went because the alternative was them coming to her workplace, and because she needed to understand what she was dealing with before she could make any decisions, and because she had spent 2 years running from a number, and running had not made the number smaller. The restaurant was mid-range, not fancy, the kind of place that had private booths in the back and clientele who valued privacy over ambiance. She wore her plainest clothes. She left her phone in her apartment because she had a sudden, vivid sense that it was not entirely private anymore. And she took a different subway route than usual and walked the last 6 blocks in a circle she made deliberately irregular. 2 men were waiting in the corner booth. Late 30s, both of them, in business casual that was slightly too neat. The neatness of people who understood that presentation was a form of control. The one on the left had a face that had been broken somewhere around the nose and hadn't healed quite straight. The one on the right had no distinguishing features whatsoever, which was its own kind of distinguishing feature. She sat across from them without being asked. "Miss Johnson," said the one on the right. Not the voice from the phone. Different man, same affectless English. "Thank you for coming." "What are the alternative arrangements?" she said. No preamble, no small talk. The 2 men exchanged a look that lasted less than a second. "Direct," said the one on the left. Not a compliment, not an insult, an assessment. $1.3 million, she said. I make $22,000 a year. Those numbers don't meet. So what are the alternative arrangements? Right side man opened a folder on the table. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a number at the top. The number from the phone call, confirmed in print. And below it, a block of text in Korean that she couldn't read. Our employer has clients, he said carefully, who are interested in certain types of personal arrangements, extended contracts, companionship of various kinds. He paused, letting that sit. The financial obligation can be fully satisfied through a term of service to one of these clients. The term would be between 18 months and 3 years depending on the specific arrangement. The noise of the restaurant continued around them. Glasses, voices, the smell of something grilled. Amara sat with her hands flat on the table and looked at the man across from her and understood, with a clarity that was almost physical, exactly what he was saying. "No," she said. "Miss Johnson?" "No." Her voice didn't shake. She was distantly surprised by this. "That is not a thing I'm going to do, so you can take that option off the table." Right side man's expression didn't change. "The alternative to that option is full payment of the outstanding balance within 30 days. I don't have $1.3 million. We're aware. Then we're at an impasse." Left side man, the one with the crooked nose, leaned forward very slightly. It was a small movement, but it changed the geometry of the table and she felt it in her sternum. "Miss Johnson, we've been very patient. Our employer's patience has a specific limit, and that limit is now 30 days. He paused. "After 30 days, the terms become non-negotiable. The arrangement will be made whether you agree to it or not. The only variable will be your level of cooperation, which affects the specific nature of the arrangement." His eyes were completely flat. "I would strongly encourage you to think carefully." She looked at him. She looked at both of them. She thought about her father, about the man he had been, complicated and reckless and intermittently wonderful, who had borrowed money from people like this for reasons she had never fully understood and died before she could ask. And she felt a grief and a rage so tangled together she couldn't separate them, a knot that had been sitting in the center of her chest for 2 years without loosening. "I'll need the 30 days, she said. Her voice was level. "To consider my options." Right side man nodded, as if this were reasonable, as if they were all reasonable people having a reasonable conversation, and the folder closed and the two men stood and left, and she sat alone in the booth with the restaurant noise around her and her hands still flat on the table, and the knowledge, absolute and cold and undeniable, that she had just been given a deadline on her own freedom. She sat there for 11 minutes. She counted them. Then she left the restaurant, walked 2 blocks, turned into a narrow street between 2 buildings, and stood against the wall and let her knees shake for a moment, because they needed to, because she'd been holding them still for the entire meeting and the body required its due. She pressed her back to the wall and breathed. 4 counts in, 4 counts out. The technique her mother had taught her when she was 12 and anxious and the world felt too large. And when her legs steadied, she pushed off the wall and walked. She did not know where she was going. She walked anyway. She ended up at the Han River, at one of the public walkways along the bank, where the city lights smeared themselves across the dark water, and a few late joggers moved through the cold in their own private rhythms. She sat on a bench and looked at the water. She thought about Atlanta. She thought about her father's face in his last year, gaunt and distant, the face of a man managing a secret that was eating him from the inside, and how she had noticed and said nothing because she had been afraid that asking meant knowing, and knowing meant she'd have to do something about it. Her phone was in her apartment. Taehyun's number was in her phone. She thought about this for a long time. She thought about the 15 minutes in the East Lounge, his voice, his questions, the way he had looked at her like she was something specific rather than something general. She thought about what Jisoo had told her when she'd looked him up that morning using a work colleague's phone, the basic outline of who Kwon Taehyun was, Cham, the syndicate, the territory, the reputation that moved through the underworld like a current. And she understood that approaching him was not a neutral act. Approaching him meant entering a world she had no map for, with people who operated by rules she didn't know. And she would be doing it in a position of total vulnerability, with nothing to offer and a debt hanging over her that could make her useful to people like him in ways she didn't want to think about. She also understood, sitting on that bench by the Han River in the cold, that she had 30 days and no money and no allies, and two men who had just told her, with complete calm, that they intended to sell her. She got up from the bench. She walked back to Mapo. She went upstairs. She picked up her phone. She looked at the number. She typed, "I need to talk to you." She stared at the message for 40 seconds. She sent it. The reply came in under 3 minutes, which meant he had been awake, which meant he had been waiting, and she didn't know whether that was comforting or terrifying and settled on both simultaneously. The reply said, "Where are you?" She typed her address. She put the phone face down on the table and sat in her kitchen and looked at her sketchbook, open to this morning's drawing. A stranger's face from the subway, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, and a jaw that looked like it had been set against something for a long time. And she thought, this is the last moment before it changes. Whatever comes through that door tonight, whatever conversation happens, whatever she says or doesn't say, the version of her life that she has been running is over. She felt this with complete certainty, the way you felt weather before it arrived. She was still looking at the drawing when the knock came. She crossed the apartment, put her hand on the door, felt the cold metal of the handle under her palm, opened it. Taehyun was standing in her hallway in a dark coat, Jisoo 2 steps behind him, and his expression when he saw her face, when he read whatever her face was doing that she wasn't controlling, shifted in a way she hadn't seen it shift before. Not softness. Something more specific than softness. The look of a man who had arrived prepared for information and had received, instead, confirmation of something he had already. Taehyun stepped inside without being invited. Not aggressively. There was no aggression in the movement, which was almost worse, because it meant the crossing of her threshold was simply something that happened the way gravity happened, without requiring her permission or her resistance. Jisoo stayed in the hallway and pulled the door closed from the outside, and then it was just the two of them in her small Mapo apartment, which suddenly felt smaller than it had ever felt, every object in it. The sketchbook stacked by the window, the unwashed teacup on the table, the painting propped against the wall that she'd never quite finished, suddenly visible in a way that felt like exposure. Taehyun looked at her face for 3 seconds. Then he looked at the apartment. One slow scan, taking inventory the way he apparently took inventory of everything, processing and filing. "Sit down," he said. "This is my apartment." "I know, sit down anyway." She sat. Not because he told her to, but because her legs had been making a case for sitting for the last hour, and she had run out of reasons to argue with them. She sat at the kitchen table, and he took the chair across from her. The same configuration as the East Lounge, except that the East Lounge had been his territory, and this was hers, and somehow that made the geometry more uncomfortable, not less. He looked at her hands. They were flat on the table again, the way they'd been flat on the table at Cheongdam Grill, and she realized this was something she did under pressure. Anchored her hands to flat surfaces as though the surface could transfer its solidity upward. "Tell me," he said. So she told him. She told him about the phone call on the platform. She told him about the black car with the running engine. She told him about Cheongdam Grill and the two men and the folder and the number, $1.3 million, and the alternative arrangements and the 30 days and the complete flatness in left side man's eyes when he told her the terms would become non-negotiable. She told him about her father, the broad outline of it, the borrowing, the debt that had apparently followed her across an ocean and found her in a city of 10 million people without breaking a sweat. She told him all of it in a voice that stayed level for most of it and frayed at the edges near the end, not dramatically, just the specific fraying that happened when you'd been holding something tightly for a long time and finally set it down. Taehyun listened. He did not interrupt. He did not shift in his chair or check his phone or offer the small sounds of sympathy that people made when they were listening with their manners rather than their attention. He simply listened with that absolute stillness, and when she finished, he was quiet for a moment that lasted long enough that she started to feel the edges of it. "The organization," he said. "The men described themselves as representing an employer. Did they give you a name?" "No." "Did they give you any documentation?" "The folder. They took it with them." "Describe the men." She described them. He listened with his eyes slightly unfocused, the way people looked when they were processing spoken information against a mental index rather than watching the speaker's face. "The crooked nose," he said. "Left side or right?" "Left." Something moved behind his eyes. "Brief." Contained. He pulled out his phone, navigated to something, turned the screen toward her. A photograph. Surveillance quality, slightly grainy. A man in a parking structure. She looked at it. Yes, that's him. Taehyun put the phone away. His jaw had tightened by a degree she might not have noticed if she hadn't been watching his face with the specific attention she brought to faces. His name is Ryu Sung-jin. He works for a syndicate called the Vega Group. They're based in Hong Kong, with operations in Seoul, Bangkok, and Manila. He paused. They specialize in debt collection and human trafficking, primarily women. The word trafficking sat in the air between them. Your father borrowed it from Vega, Taehyun continued. That means the original lender wasn't a local operation. Vega doesn't lend to individuals without strategic intent. They lend to people they've already identified as having family members who can be leveraged. He looked at her. Your father didn't borrow money from Vega, Amara. Vega targeted your father specifically because of you. The kitchen was very quiet. What does that mean? She said. Her voice came out smaller than she intended. It means the debt is not the point. The debt is the mechanism. You were the asset from the beginning. He said it without cruelty, which somehow made it land harder than cruelty would have. Your father was the access route. The debt creates the legal, or quasi-legal, claim. The 30-day deadline is theater. They've already identified a buyer. She pressed both hands flat against the table, pressed hard. My father didn't know that. Probably not. Vega is sophisticated. They would have presented themselves as a straightforward lender. A pause. He would have believed he was borrowing money. He would have believed he was solving a problem. She looked at the wall, at the unfinished painting, a face half-rendered, the eyes not yet right. He had gambling debts, she said. Real ones. From before. From when I was in high school. He'd been clean for years, I thought, but he wasn't. She exhaled slowly. He came to me 2 months before he died and said he'd made a mistake and that he'd fixed it. He seemed relieved. He seemed like the weight had come off. She paused. I didn't ask what the mistake was. I didn't ask how he'd fixed it. I was so relieved that he seemed okay that I didn't push. You couldn't have known. I know I couldn't have known, her voice sharpened. That doesn't help me very much right now. He accepted this without reaction. The 30 days is real in this sense. It's the window before they activate the buyer contract. Once that activates, extraction becomes significantly more complicated. He was quiet for a moment. I can handle this. She looked at him. What does that mean? It means I have the reach to dismantle Vega's Seoul operation and to make their Hong Kong principals understand that the claim on you is closed. And what does that cost me? The question landed. He looked at her steadily. Nothing. That's not how the world works. It's how I'm offering it to work. Why? She held his gaze. She needed the answer. She needed it the way she needed the flat surface under her hands, as something solid to orient against. You've known me for less than 48 hours. I'm a catering employee. I have no connections, no money, nothing that's useful to you. So why? He was quiet for long enough that she started to think he wasn't going to answer. Then, because I've spent 12 years doing things for strategic reasons. Because every decision I've made since I was 22 years old has been evaluated against its utility, its leverage, its downstream effect on the organization. He looked at her, not through her, not past her, directly at her, with the same quality of attention he'd turned on her from 52 floors above. You looked up at the sky after you dropped a tray of champagne, and you smiled because you found it funny. You didn't perform anything. You didn't manage anything. You just were. She didn't say anything. I don't have a strategic reason, he said. That's the answer. Jisoo's reaction when Tae-hyun briefed him in the hallway 40 minutes later while Amara made the tea she actually drank this time, was communicated entirely through the architecture of his face, the specific set of his jaw, the fractional narrowing of his eyes, the quality of stillness that in Jisoo's case meant active computation rather than passive waiting. Vega, Jisoo said. Yes. Marcus Vega's organization. Yes. Jisoo breathed slowly through his nose. Taehyun. Vega has a standing agreement with the Cheong Consortium. The Cheong Consortium has a standing agreement with 3 of our Eastern Territory contacts. He paused. Moving against Vega's sole operation is not a contained action. It pulls strings. I know what it pulls. The board will want to discuss. The board will be informed. Jisu's jaw tightened. I'm not the board. I'm telling you as someone who has watched your back for 15 years that this is a significant escalation for a personal reason. He paused. That's not a judgment. That's a strategic assessment. I hear it. And? And I've made the decision. Taehyun looked at the closed apartment door. Get me everything current on Vega's sole infrastructure, safe houses, personnel, the buyer pipeline. I want it by morning. Jisoo looked at him for a moment with the expression of a man accepting an outcome he had not been able to prevent. By morning, he said, and took out his phone. What? The information Jisoo assembled by 4 a.m. was thorough. In the way that information assembled by people who understood consequences was thorough. No gaps, no softened edges, no details omitted because they were uncomfortable. Taehyun read it at the small table in Amar's kitchen while she slept in the next room, the apartment quiet around him, Seoul's early morning gray beginning to thin the darkness outside the window. He read it twice. On the second read, something in the document stopped him. It was a name, a single name, embedded in the personnel section of Vega's Seoul operation, listed as a local liaison, responsible for target identification and initial debt structuring. A name he knew. A name that had been in his contact list for 6 years, attached to a man he had trusted with middle-tier organizational intelligence on 4 separate occasions. A man who had never given him reason for doubt. Oh Jae-won. He sat with this for a moment. Oh Jae-won had been the one to flag the Shin Group gala to him 3 weeks ago, had recommended his attendance as a relationship maintenance move, had described it as a useful networking opportunity, had made the case for it with the particular persuasiveness of someone who had a good reason for wanting you in a specific location at a specific time. Taehyun was at the Shin Group gala when Amara dropped the tray. He was on that terrace, at that railing, at that exact moment, because Jae-won had placed him there. He put the document down. He looked at the wall. He thought about Jae-won's face, the easy sociability of it, the quality of warmth that Taehyun had always assessed as genuine, which he was now reassessing as performed, and he felt something move through him that was colder than anger and more focused. Anger was ambient. This was specific. This was the particular temperature of a man who had been moved like a piece on a board by someone who understood his habits well enough to manufacture the conditions for an outcome. Jae-won had known about Amara, had known she was a Vega target, had known that Taehyun had never shown interest in anyone, and had calculated, correctly it turned out, that if the right person were placed in his line of sight under the right conditions, the outcome would serve Vega's interests. Because if Taehyun became interested in Amara, Vega had leverage on him. Not through the debt, not through Amara directly, through him, through the fact of his interest, which could be used to force concessions, to compromise his decision-making, to create a vulnerability in the Kwan Syndicate's eastern operations that Vega and the Cheong Consortium had apparently been positioning to exploit for 2 years. The apartment was quiet. Amara's breathing was audible from the other room, slow even, the breathing of someone who had finally, after days of tension, reached the hard floor of sleep. He picked up his phone. He called Jisoo. Oh Jae-won, he said, when Jisoo picked up on the second ring. A pause. What about him? He's in the document, Vega's local liaison. Silence on the line. Long enough to mean Jisoo was processing, recalibrating, running back through the history of every interaction that now needed to be recontextualized. The gala, Jisoo said finally. Yes. He set you up. Yes. Another silence. How deep does it go? That's what I need to know by this afternoon. Taehyun's voice was the same temperature it always was. The specific temperature of rooms that had been deliberately climate-controlled. Find out what he's passed to them and when. Find out who else in our contact network has been turned. He paused. Don't move on him yet. I want the full picture first. Understood. Jisoo paused. Taehyun, if Jae-won's been feeding Vega intelligence for any significant length of time, our eastern operations may already be compromised. The Cheong Consortium. I know. This isn't just about the woman anymore. I know that too. Taehyun looked toward the bedroom door. That doesn't change anything. He ended the call. Put the phone face down on the table, looked at the document, looked at O.J. name sitting in the middle of it like a splinter. He had trusted Jae-won with mid-tier intelligence on 4 occasions. He cataloged those 4 occasions now, rapidly, identifying what Jae-won had had access to and what the downstream effects of that access might be. The picture that assembled itself was not catastrophic, yet, but it was serious in the way that discovered leaks were serious. The damage depended entirely on how long the leak had been running before you found it. The bedroom door opened. Amara came out in yesterday's clothes, her hair loose, her eyes carrying the particular quality of someone who had slept hard out of pure exhaustion and woken into the awareness that the hard sleep had not actually resolved anything. She looked at him at the table, looked at the document, looked back at him. "You didn't sleep," she said. "No." She moved to the kitchen, filled the kettle, turned it on. These small, automatic movements, the familiar choreography of mornings, looked different in her, he thought, less automatic, more deliberate, like she was making a choice in each small action to continue occupying her own life. "Did you find something?" she said. Not a question exactly. She already knew. She could read it in the quality of his stillness, which had changed overnight in a way she couldn't have named but felt. Yes. She turned, looked at him. Bad. Complicated. Tell me. He told her about Jae-won, about the gala, about the construction of the circumstances that had placed him on that terrace at that railing at the moment she had looked up at the sky. He told her plainly, without softening it, because she had asked and because she had earned the unedited version. She listened with her arms crossed and her back against the counter and her face doing the thing it had done in the East Lounge, processing without performing, letting the information actually land rather than managing the appearance of receiving it. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "So I was bait," she said. "You were a mechanism. There's a distinction. From where I'm standing, that distinction is pretty thin." Her voice was controlled, tightly controlled, the kind of tight that meant something significant was being compressed behind it. "They targeted my father to get to me, and then they used me to get to you. My entire life for the past 2 years has been a sequence of moves in someone else's game." She unfolded her arms, folded them again. "My father died. He died scared and guilty and carrying this thing alone. And it was because some organization in Hong Kong looked at our family and saw a pathway to leverage a Korean crime boss they'd never even met." The kettle boiled. She didn't move toward it. "I want to know something," she said. Her eyes were very direct. "If Jae-won hadn't placed you at that gala, if you'd never seen me, what would have happened to me?" He held her gaze. "Vega would have activated the buyer contract within the 30-day window. You would have been extracted from Seoul." The word extracted. "Extracted," she repeated very quietly. "Yes." She turned away, looked out the window at the morning street below. The Pojang Matcha owner was at his cart again, and the sameness of it, the identical ordinary morning, indifferent to everything that had shifted in this apartment overnight, seemed to do something to her, some final tightening of a wire that had been tightening since the platform. "What do you need from me?" she said, still facing the window. "Right now, nothing. Stay here. Don't use your phone for anything other than—" "No." She turned back. "I mean, what do you actually need to do this? To go after Vega and deal with Jae-won and protect the organization and handle all of it?" Her voice was steady. Her eyes were not unstable, but lit from somewhere deep, the specific illumination of a person who has just arrived at a decision that costs something. "I'm not going to sit in this apartment while you burn things down on my behalf and pretend I'm not part of it. What do you need?" He looked at her for a moment. "I need to know everything about your father's contact with Vega. Every detail you have, however small, names, dates, locations, anything he said or wrote or—" "He left me a letter," she said. The apartment went very still. "When he died, he left me a letter. I read the first paragraph and I put it away because I wasn't ready." She moved to the bedroom. He heard a drawer open. She came back with an envelope, plain white, her name on the front in handwriting that was clearly a sick man's handwriting, the letters slightly uneven, slightly pressured, the handwriting of someone trying to be precise while their hands were unreliable. She held it out. He looked at the envelope, then at her face. "He wrote it in English," she said. "He wanted me to be able to read it." Her voice fractured on the last word, just slightly, just for a second, and then composed itself. "Read it. If there's something in there that helps, use it." He took the envelope. He opened it. The letter was 3 pages, handwritten on hotel stationery from an Atlanta Marriott, dated 11 days before David Johnson's death. Tae-hyun read it with the specific, focused attention he brought to documents that mattered, and by the second page he understood why Amara had put it in a drawer and not gone back to it, and by the third page he understood something else, something that reframed the entire shape of what he thought he was dealing with. David Johnson had not simply borrowed money from Vega. He had, in the months before the borrowing, been approached by a man who identified himself as a financial consultant, a man who had spent 4 months cultivating David's trust before introducing him to Vega's representatives as a solution to his gambling debts. That man's name, spelled out in David Johnson's increasingly unsteady handwriting, was a name Tae-hyun had not been expecting. He read it again. Then he set the letter down on the table with the precise, controlled care of someone handling something that had just become extremely significant, and looked at the wall, and understood that the thing he was dealing with was not what he had thought it was 12 hours ago, or even 2 hours ago, and that the machinery behind Amara's situation was older and more deliberate, and more specifically targeted at him than he had understood, and that the person who had set all of it in motion was not OJ1, who was a piece, a local instrument, a hand, but not a... The name in David Johnson's letter was Kwon Sung-jae, Tae-hyun's uncle, his father's younger brother. The man who had sat at every family table, who had attended every organizational meeting for 22 years, who had been passed over for leadership when Tae-hyun's father died, and Tae-hyun had taken the seat at 26. Passed over not by politics or maneuvering, but simply by the fact that Tae-hyun's father had never considered Sung-jae for the role, had considered him capable but not suited, had written his succession clearly and without ambiguity, and left Sung-jae to find his own accommodation with that fact. 8 years. Sung-jae had been accommodating that fact for 8 years. Tae-hyun sat at Amara's kitchen table and looked at the name and did the arithmetic. 8 years of patience. 8 years of smiling at organizational meetings and offering counsel and positioning himself as the trusted uncle, the steady elder presence, while quietly building a relationship with Vega and the Cheong Consortium that was designed not for financial gain, Sung-jae had money, had always had money, but for something more specific, something more personal. Not a takeover, a dismantling. The plan, as it assembled itself in Tae-hyun's mind with the horrible clarity of something that had always been true and was only now visible, was not to seize the Kwon Syndicate. It was to break it, to expose Tae-hyun's eastern operations through Jae-won's intelligence leak, to compromise his territorial agreements through the Cheong Consortium pressure, and to do it all through the mechanism of a personal vulnerability that Sung-jae had spent years observing and calculating and waiting for Tae-hyun to develop. Sung-jae had known, better than anyone, that Tae-hyun did not have personal vulnerabilities. So he had built one, had found a young woman in Atlanta with a grieving family and a father drowning in debt, had constructed the conditions for her arrival in Seoul, had waited for the right moment to place her in Tae-hyun's line of sight, had banked on the possibility, the calculated probability, that Tae-hyun, who had spent 8 years impenetrable to every human connection, would not be impenetrable to this one. He had been right. Tae-hyun set the letter down, folded his hands on top of it, breathed slowly, once, through his nose. Amara was watching him from across the table. She had seen the change in his face when he reached the name, had not known what caused it, but had read its severity with the precision of someone who understood faces at a fundamental level. She said nothing. She waited. "The man who approached your father," Tae-hyun said. "His name is Kwon Sung-jae. You know him. He's my uncle." The apartment absorbed this. Outside, a truck moved through the street below, its engine loud in the morning quiet, and then the quiet returned and sat between them. "How long has he been planning this?" she said. "At minimum 3 years, possibly longer." Tae-hyun's voice was level in the way that a surface was level after everything beneath it had shifted. Technically accurate, structurally unreliable. "Your father was approached approximately 3 years ago. The intelligence leak through Jae-won began..." I need to confirm this, probably around the same time. And the gala, placing you there. The final mechanism. Once he had the infrastructure in place, the debt claim, the buyer pipeline, the territorial pressure through Chung, he needed me to develop a personal stake. Something he could use to force my hand, or, if the plan ran differently, to paralyze my decision-making at a critical moment. He looked at her. He chose correctly. I have a personal stake. Amara looked at her hands, at the letter, partially visible beneath Tae-hyun's folded ones. My father died carrying guilt for something that was done to him, she said. Her voice was very quiet and very controlled. He spent his last year thinking he'd put me in danger because of his weakness. He died thinking it was his fault. Yes. And it wasn't his fault. No. She pressed her lips together, looked at the window, looked back at him. Something had shifted in her face that he recognized from the platform, from the kitchen floor, from every moment in the past 48 hours where she had been required to absorb something unbearable and choose, in the absorbing, what to do with it. The choice she was making now was visible in the set of her jaw and the stillness of her hands and the specific quality of her eyes, which had moved past the landscape of grief into something harder and more deliberate. What do we do? She said. He picked up his phone and called Jisoo. Jisoo arrived at the apartment 20 minutes later with two other men, Han Dong-wook and Lim Chae-sung, both senior operational, both present since before Tae-hyun took the organization's leadership. They came in quietly and stood in the small living room with the particular physical economy of men who were used to being in spaces that required them to be unobtrusive. And Tae-hyun told them about Sung-jae in the same flat, precise voice he used for all operational briefings. The silence that followed was different from the silence after Amara's kitchen revelation. This was the silence of men recalibrating histories, rerunning years of interactions and decisions through a new interpretive filter, identifying the moments that now looked different, feeling the specific vertigo of discovering that a trusted presence had been a vector. Jisoo said nothing for a full 30 seconds. Then, the Busan meeting, 4 months ago, Sung-jae was in the building. Yes. He would have had access to the pre-meeting brief. Yes. Tae-hyun looked at him. How much of the Busan framework has Cheong been able to anticipate? Jisoo's jaw worked. Enough. They've been ahead of us on 3 territorial movements in the last quarter. I attributed it to good intelligence gathering on their end. He stopped. It was good intelligence gathering, just not theirs. Dong-wook, who was 51 and had been with the organization since Tae-hyun's father's time, said, "Where is Sung-jae now?" His apartment in Seocho. He has a meeting scheduled with 2 of our southern contacts this afternoon at 3. Tae-hyun checked his watch. It was 6:40 a.m. He doesn't know yet that I've seen the letter. He doesn't know Jaewon's been identified. As far as he's aware, the plan is still running. We move before 3, Dong-wook said. We move before 3. Tae-hyun looked at Jisoo. Jaewon first. I want him contained before Sung-jae has any opportunity to be warned. Then we deal with Vega's Seoul operation, the safe house in Yeongdongpo, the buyer pipeline. We shut the pipeline before the 30-day clock matters. He paused. Sung-jae is last. I handle Sung-jae personally. Jisoo looked at him with the expression that meant he had something to say and was evaluating whether to say it. You're sure about personally? Yes. He's family, Tae-hyun. I know what he is. Jisoo held his gaze for a moment, then nodded. The word personally had been accepted. Nobody in this room was going to argue with it. Oh, Jaewon was eating breakfast at his apartment in Yongsan when Dong-wook and Chae-sung arrived at 7:40 a.m. He answered the door in a robe, fork still in hand, and had approximately 1 second to understand what was happening before Dong-wook's hand closed around his forearm and the fork became irrelevant. They brought him to a logistics space in the Mapo industrial belt, a warehouse the organization used for meetings that required privacy without the formality of the main facilities. Tae-hyun was already there when they arrived, standing near the center of the space with his hands in his coat pockets and the overhead lights making the room look exactly as cold as it was. Jaewon was placed in a chair. He was not restrained, which was a choice. Unrestrained meant he was being offered the dignity of sitting voluntarily, which meant the conversation could be something other than an interrogation if he made it so. He was 42, had the lean, well-maintained look of a man who ran regularly and slept adequately, and was currently attempting to compose his face into something that read as confused rather than afraid. He was not succeeding entirely. "Tae-hyun," he said. "What? Don't." Tae-hyun's voice was quiet. "Don't open with confusion. We both know what this is." Jae-won looked at the men standing at the room's perimeter, looked back at Tae-hyun. The confusion performance dissolved. What replaced it was something more honest and more unpleasant. The face of a man calculating his remaining options in real time and finding the inventory sparse. "How long?" Tae-hyun said. "A beat." 3 years. "What did you pass?" "Eastern Territory Movement Schedules, the Busan Framework Summary, the Incheon Corridor Financials." He paused. "The Shin Group Gala attendee list marked with your confirmation." "Who approached you?" "Sung-jae directly, 3 years ago. He told me the organization's long-term interests would be better served under a restructured leadership. That you were too isolated, too—" He stopped. "Finish it." "Too emotionally inaccessible to make the alliances the organization needed for the next decade." Jae-won looked at the floor. "He wasn't wrong about that part." "No," Tae-hyun said. "He wasn't." He studied Jae-won's face for a moment. "The woman, Amara Johnson. You knew who she was before the gala." "I knew she was a Vega target. I knew the basic structure of the debt claim. Sung-jae told me the plan was to create a personal liability for you, someone you'd feel compelled to protect, and then use that liability as pressure." He looked up. His eyes were the eyes of a man who had arrived at a point past justification and was now operating purely in the territory of fact. "I didn't know about the buyer pipeline. I didn't know the extent of what Vega intended to do with her. Would it have changed your decision?" A long pause. "I don't know," Jae-won said. And the awful thing, the thing that landed with actual weight, was that it sounded true. Tae-hyun looked at him for a moment. Then he turned and walked toward the exit. "Tae-hyun." Jae-won's voice, from behind him, had lost all its performance entirely. It was just a man's voice in a cold room. "What happens now?" "You'll stay here until this afternoon. After that, you'll be escorted out of Seoul. You have a sister in Daegu. Go there." He didn't turn around. "Don't contact anyone from the organization. Don't contact Sung-jae. If I hear that you've done either, the conversation we just had becomes a different kind of conversation." He left. The Vega Safe House in Yeongdongpo was a fourth-floor apartment in a building that looked like 40 other buildings on the same block. Chosen, presumably, for exactly that quality of architectural anonymity. Jisoo had the address by 9 a.m. By 10:30, he had the floor plan, the personnel count, 4 men, rotating in 12-hour shifts, and the confirmation that the buyer pipeline's primary documentation was stored on site rather than in cloud infrastructure, which meant a physical operation was necessary and sufficient. Tae-hyun went himself. Jisoo argued for sending Dong-wook's team and was overruled with the specific, quiet decisiveness that ended arguments. They went in at 11:15, 4 of them, through the building's service entrance, and the operation was not clean in the cinematic sense. Clean in the operational sense, meaning the objectives were achieved without collateral complications. But it was not bloodless. The first man came out of the kitchen fast, and Tae-hyun took the hit across his left shoulder, the edge of something hard, a forearm or a door, he couldn't immediately determine which, and felt the impact radiate down into his hand and up into his neck and filed it under later without breaking movement. He moved the way he had been trained to move since his father put him in front of instructors at age 15. Not gracefully, not the way action looked in the stories people told about it, but with the specific ugly efficiency of someone who had learned that hesitation was more dangerous than imperfection. The man went down. Tae-hyun's shoulder was loudly unhappy. He noted both facts and kept moving. Jisoo took the bedroom. Chae-sung and a man named Baek held the hallway. The fourth Vega operative made it to the window before Dong-wook reached him, and what followed was brief and loud and resolved in Dong-wook's favor. The documentation was in a waterproof case under the bathroom sink, the buyer pipeline records, the debt claim files, Amara's father's original paperwork with Vega's intake stamps and signatures, the operational contacts for Vega's Seoul to Manila transfer route. Everything. The entire infrastructure of the claim on Amara Johnson, physical and complete, sitting in a bathroom cabinet in Yeongdeungpo like something that had always known it would eventually be found. Taehyun stood in his bathroom with the case open in his hands and looked at David Johnson's signature on the original document, the signature of a man who had not understood what he was signing, which was visible in the signature itself, in its normalcy, its lack of the particular quality that signatures carried when people knew they were signing something that would cost them everything. He closed the case. His shoulder had started to stiffen. He rolled it once, felt the specific grinding complaint of a joint that had been impacted along its wrong axis, and accepted that it was going to be significant by tonight and catastrophic by tomorrow, and was currently manageable, which was all that was required. Outside, Jisoo was on his phone. He ended the call as Taehyun came through the apartment door. Sungjae moved up his timeline, he said. His voice was controlled, but the control was doing more work than usual. He's not at Seocho. He left his apartment at 10 a.m. His car was tracked to the Mapo area. Taehyun went still. Mapo. He knows, Jisoo said. Someone warned him. Not Jaewon. Jaewon's been contained since 8 a.m. But someone in the contact network flagged the Yeongdeungpo operation. He paused. He's going to Amara's building, Taehyun. The stairwell, down 4 flights, out through the service entrance, into the car. Jisoo was already talking to Baek, who had stayed in Mapo, had been assigned to the building's exterior as a precaution that now looked like the most important decision of the morning. Taehyun was in the passenger seat before Jisoo finished the call, and the car was moving before the door fully closed. Baek, Taehyun said. He sees the car. Sungjae and 2 others went in 4 minutes ago. Baek is on the exterior. He can't go in alone. 4 minutes. The distance from Yeongdeungpo to Mapo was not far. At 11:30 a.m. in Seoul traffic, it was not short either. Jisoo drove with the focused aggression of someone who understood that the speed of this car in the next 7 minutes was the most important variable currently in play. And Taehyun sat in the passenger seat with the documentation case on his lap and his damaged shoulder pressed against the door, and watched the city move past the window and did not allow himself to think about anything except the sequence of actions required when they arrived, because the alternative, the space where fear for another person lived, was a place he could not afford to be right now, not while the car was still moving, not while the sequence was still executable. His phone buzzed. Unknown number. Not Baek's. Not anyone in the organization. He answered. Nephew. Sungjae's voice was the same voice it had always been, warm, measured, with the specific register of a man who had spent decades presenting himself as the most reasonable person in any room. I think we should talk. Taehyun said nothing. I'm in the building. I'm not sure what to call her. Your interest. A pause. She's fine. I haven't done anything. I'm not here to hurt her, Taehyun. I'm here because I think you need to understand something before this goes any further. Get out of the building. Listen to me. What I built with Vega, it was never about destroying you. The organization under your father was magnificent. Under you, it became something different, colder, more efficient, yes. More profitable, certainly, but isolated in ways that were making it brittle. I was trying to force a correction. Through a 26-year-old woman whose father you targeted. Through the only mechanism available to me. His voice didn't change. You don't respond to organizational pressure. You don't respond to political maneuvering. You are, as I've observed for 8 years, entirely unmoved by every conventional form of influence. A pause. So I found the unconventional form. Get out of the building, Taehyun said again. The car was on the Mapo Bridge, 4 minutes. Come talk to me first. Come up and sit down and let me explain the full scope of what I've built and what it offers. Not as a threat, as a proposal. The Chang Consortium is not your enemy. Vega can be restructured. The Eastern Territorial, you had her father killed. The words came out at a different temperature than everything else. Not louder, not faster, but at a specific temperature that was below cold, below the clinical flatness of operational language, at the temperature where things froze and became breakable. The letter your man had him sign. The terms he didn't understand. The debt that couldn't be paid. You built a mechanism designed to make him feel responsible for something that was done to him, and then you let him die carrying it. Silence on the line, long silence. I didn't anticipate his death, Sungjae said. His health. You built the conditions. Tae-hyun. I'm 4 minutes away, Tae-hyun said. If she is not standing in that hallway unharmed when I walk through that door, this conversation ends and a different one begins. Do you understand me? The line was quiet. Then Sungjae said very quietly something that Tae-hyun had not expected and that landed in the car like a physical weight. I have the original dead instrument. The real one, not the copy in your documentation case. The one with the supplementary clause that extends the claim to collateral family members in the event of the primary holder's death. A pause. My copy is the enforceable one, Tae-hyun. Without it, Amar Johnson is free. With it, Vega still has a legal instrument, and Vega has 3 other cells in Seoul that you haven't located yet. Jisoo's hands tightened on the wheel. Come up, Sungjae said, alone, and we'll talk about what a clean resolution looks like for everyone. The car turned into the Mapo Street. Amara's building was visible ahead. The ordinary low-rise, the Pojangmacha cart on the corner, the completely normal Saturday morning street that had no idea what was happening inside it. Tae-hyun looked at the building. His shoulder was grinding. His jaw was set. The documentation case was on his lap, and inside it was everything except the one document that apparently still mattered. And his uncle was 4 floors up in the building with the woman who had looked at the sky after dropping a tray and smiled because she found it funny. And the man on the phone was waiting for an answer with the patience of someone who believed he had already. He got out of the car. Jisoo reached across the center console and caught his arm. Not aggressively, not a restraint, just a hand on a forearm that meant, wait 1 second. Tae-hyun looked at him. You go up alone. You have no leverage, Jisoo said. His voice was the lowest it ever went, which was very low. He has the document. He has 2 men, and you have a shoulder that's been compromised since Yeongdeung-po. I know. Then you know going up there on his terms is the only move that keeps her out of it. Tae-hyun held Jisoo's gaze. If I send men in, he burns the document or he uses her as the exit. Either way, she's still inside the claim. He paused. He wants to talk. Let him talk. And if talking isn't actually what he wants, then we find that out. He opened the door. Beck stays on the exterior. You stay on the phone. If I don't send a confirmation text within 20 minutes, you come up with everyone. Jisoo released his arm, looked at him with the face of a man who had watched a friend walk toward bad situations for 15 years and had learned at significant personal cost the difference between situations that could be argued against and situations that had already been decided. 20 minutes, Jisoo said. Tae-hyun crossed the street. The building's lobby was empty. Saturday morning, most residents out or still sleeping. He took the stairs, not the elevator, because the elevator announced arrival and the stairs did not. His shoulder moved badly on the second flight, something grinding in the joint that sent a hot wire of pain up into his neck and down into his elbow, and he breathed through it the way he'd been taught to breathe through physical pain, not suppressing it, not fighting it, simply acknowledging it as information and routing around it, because the body's complaints were data, and data was useful, but it was not directive. 3rd floor landing. 4th floor. He stopped outside Amara's door. It was slightly ajar, not fully open, just released from the latch, the way a door sat when someone had entered without fully closing it behind them. He put his right hand flat against the wood and pushed it open slowly. The apartment looked the same as he had left it 6 hours ago. The kettle on the counter, the sketchbooks by the window, the unfinished painting against the wall, the kitchen table where he had read David Johnson's letter and understood for the first time the full shape of what had been done. Sungjae was standing near the window. He was 61 years old and looked, as he always had, like a man 10 years younger, trim, composed, with a face that had been handsome in youth and had aged into something that read as distinguished. The kind of face that belonged in boardrooms and at family tables, and at the funerals of people whose deaths you had quietly arranged. He was wearing a dark coat over a gray sweater. His hands were at his sides, visible, which was either a gesture of good faith or a performance of it. One man stood near the bedroom door, another near the kitchen, both mid-30s, both carrying the specific physical density of men whose primary function was absorbing problems. Neither was visibly armed, which meant nothing about whether they were armed. Amara was sitting at the kitchen table. She was upright, her hands flat on the table surface in the way she always anchored them under pressure, and she was looking at Sungjae with an expression that Tae-hyun recognized and that no one who didn't understand her face would have been able to read correctly. It was not fear. Fear had a quality of contraction to it, the body pulling inward, the face tightening around its own center. What Amara was doing was the opposite. She was expanded. Perfectly still, yes, but expanded, present in every centimeter of her body, processing the room with the specific total attention of someone who has decided, in the face of a threat, to see everything clearly rather than look away from any of it. She looked at Ta-hyun when he came through the door. Something in her face shifted. Not relief exactly, not the release of a person who has been waiting for rescue, but the particular recognition of someone who had been holding a position alone and now understood they were no longer alone in holding it. Her hands stayed flat on the table. Sungjae turned from the window. He looked at Tae-hyun with an expression that was genuinely and disturbingly warm. The warmth of a man who believed the situation was still navigable on his terms. You came alone. I said I would. Your shoulder. Sungjae noted it without emotion. The way Tae-hyun was carrying his left arm slightly lower, the imperceptible shift in his stance. Young Dungpo? Yes. Sit down. Both of you. He said it with the ease of someone in their own home, and the ease of it was itself a form of pressure. The insistence that this was a conversation between equals in a space he had temporarily claimed. He moved to the chair at the head of the table and sat, folding his hands on the surface, and looked between them. Tae-hyun did not sit. He stood 3 feet inside the door with his right hand loose at his side and his left arm held carefully, and looked at his uncle with the full flatness of his attention. The document, he said. Sungjae reached into his inside coat pocket and placed a folded paper on the table. Not toward Tae-hyun. In the center, equidistant, a thing to be negotiated over rather than surrendered. The supplementary clause is on page 3. It's executed properly. Vega's legal team confirmed the instrument is enforceable under Hong Kong commercial law, which governs the original agreement. He looked at Amara. I want you to understand that this is not a threat. It's a negotiating position. The difference matters. Amara looked at the document, looked at him. My father didn't know what he was signing. No, he didn't. Sungjae's voice was even. That is regrettable. Regrettable, she repeated. The word came out very flat. Miss Johnson, I want to be honest with you about something. He shifted slightly in his chair, not nervously, adjusting for directness. Your situation was a mechanism. I chose it because it was effective, not because of anything personal toward you or your family. The debt instrument exists because it was the cleanest way to create a legitimate claim that could be activated or withdrawn based on how negotiations with my nephew proceeded. He paused. I am offering to withdraw it entirely, today, in exchange for a conversation about the future of the Kwan organization and my role in it. Silence. That's what this is, Tae-hyun said. 8 years, 3 years of infrastructure. A dead man in Atlanta and a woman you've had surveilled for 5 weeks. His voice was at its most level, which meant it was at its most dangerous. For a conversation about your role. Something moved across Sungjae's face. Not guilt. Something more complex than guilt. The expression of a man who understood the magnitude of what he'd done and had made his peace with it through the architecture of justification. Your father chose you, he said, not because you were more capable, because you were more like him, because he saw in you the same emotional distance that he believed was the organization's greatest strength. He looked at Tae-hyun steadily. He was wrong about that, and you've spent 8 years proving him right and making the organization exactly as strong and exactly as brittle as I told him it would become. So you decided to fix it. I decided to force a correction before the brittleness became structural failure. He looked at the document in the center of the table. The Cheong Consortium's pressure on your Eastern operations is real, Tae-hyun. The intelligence leak through J1 has compromised 3 territorial agreements. That damage is done regardless of what happens in this room today. The question is whether the organization survives it intact, or whether it survives it as something smaller and weaker and permanently defensive. He spread his hands. I can fix what I helped break. That's the offer. Taehyun was quiet for a moment. Then he crossed to the table. He pulled out the chair across from Sung-jae and sat in it, and the movement was so controlled and so deliberate that both men near the walls adjusted their posture without quite knowing why. He reached across and picked up the document, opened it, read the supplementary clause on page 3 with the focused attention he brought to all documents that mattered. Then he set it back down. Here is what's going to happen, he said. His voice was completely even. Not cold. That wasn't quite the right word for it anymore. It was the voice of a man who had arrived, through a night and a morning of significant revision, at a clarity so complete that there was nothing in it to inflect. You're going to sign the withdrawal clause on this document. You're going to contact your Vega principal and confirm that the claim on Amara Johnson is closed and that any further pursuit of the claim will be treated as a declaration of conflict with the Kwan organization. You're going to give me the names of every contact in our network that you've turned or compromised in the past 3 years. Sung-jae watched him. In exchange for these things, Taehyun continued, you will be removed from all organizational roles and from Seoul within 48 hours. You'll receive a settlement that covers your existing assets and nothing more. You will have no further contact with Vega, with Chung, or with any member of the organization. He paused. And you will not contact me again. Sung-jae was quiet for a long moment. His face had the quality of a man receiving an outcome he had not expected and was recalibrating against. You're not going to hear the offer. I heard it. The organizational damage is mine to repair. Taehyun looked at his uncle with the specific quality of attention that was the final form of something that had once been a different feeling. The organization is mine, Sung-jae. My father understood that. You never did, which is the thing that neither of us can fix regardless of what's decided in this room today. He paused. You chose correctly about one thing. I was isolated. The organization was becoming brittle in the way you described. He let that land. You were right about the problem. You were entirely wrong about your right to address it. Something in Sung-jae's composure shifted. Not dramatically, not the collapse of a man whose position had failed, but the smaller, more private adjustment of a man who had been holding a narrative about his own motivations for years and had just heard it named in a way that made the narrative visible as a narrative. As a story he had told himself rather than a truth he had discovered. His eyes moved to Amara. Briefly, just a second, then back to Taehyun. He reached into his coat, removed a pen, signed the withdrawal clause, slid the document across the table. The 2 men near the walls left when Sung-jae stood. No instruction required. They read the room the way men in their profession read rooms, which was with the total body attention of people for whom misreading was costly. Sung-jae buttoned his coat. He looked at Taehyun with an expression that had shed its performance entirely and arrived at something raw and more honest than anything he'd displayed in the conversation. Something that was, if not remorse, at least its geographic neighbor. Your father would have done it differently, he said. Yes, Taehyun said. He would have. Sung-jae looked at Amara. A look that was brief and direct and carried in it the specific gravity of a man acknowledging, without being able to adequately address, the cost of what he'd done. She looked back at him steadily, did not offer anything, did not look away. He left. The door closed. The apartment was very quiet. Taehyun sat at the table with the signed document in front of him and his damaged shoulder and the specific exhaustion of a body that had been running on decision and adrenaline for 18 hours and was beginning to understand that both of those things were finite. He breathed slowly. Once. Twice. Amara had not moved from her chair. She was looking at the document, at David Johnson's original signature on the first page, the normal signature, the signature of a man who hadn't understood, and the withdrawal clause on page 3, now executed, now closing the instrument that his death had left open. She reached out and put 2 fingers on the corner of the document, did not pick it up, just touched it. Is it over? She said. The claim is closed. Vega will be contacted today. Their sole infrastructure is already down. He paused. The three other cells Sung Jae mentioned, Jisoo, will have locations by tonight. They'll be addressed. That's not what I asked. He looked at her. Yes, he said. It's over. She pressed her lips together, nodded once, very small. A nod that was mostly internal, the physical echo of something settling that had been unsettled for a very long time. She took her fingers off the document, put her hand in her lap. Then she said, I need you to leave. He was still. Not permanently, just... She stopped, looked at the wall, at the unfinished painting, the half-rendered face, the eyes not yet right. I need the apartment to myself for a little while. I need to sit here alone and, I don't know, just be in it. She looked at him. Her eyes were dry. She was not going to cry in front of him, which he understood was not about him at all, but about the particular way she held herself in the presence of other people. The conservation of the most private things for private spaces. There are people I need to call. My mother. I've been keeping this from her for 2 years and I need to tell her it's finished. Okay. He stood, picked up the document. He would have Jisoo file the withdrawal with Vega's legal representatives and retain the original. He moved toward the door. Tae-hyun. He stopped. She was looking at him from the table, the same way she had looked at him in the East Lounge, without performance, without management, with the total directness of a person who had decided to simply see what was in front of her and let it be what it was. Thank you, she said. And then, because she was constitutionally unable to leave the accurate thing unsaid, and I'm sorry about your uncle. He stood in the doorway with his hand on the frame and looked at her and felt something that he had no name for, or rather, had a name for, but had not associated with his own experience in so long that the association required a moment of adjustment, the way a room that has been dark for a long time required a moment when the light came back before you could see it properly. So am I, he said. He left. He had his shoulder assessed by the organization's physician that afternoon. A clean, deep bruise, nothing structural, requiring ice and rest and the anti-inflammatory medication that the physician prescribed and Tae-hyun accepted and did not take. He spent 4 hours with Jisoo working through the network damage assessment, identifying the compromised contacts, beginning the quiet and careful work of restructuring the Eastern Territorial Agreements on foundations that were not undermined. It was meticulous work, unglamorous work, the kind of work that made no good story but was the actual substance of what it meant to run something, the endless, unglamorous repair. The 3 remaining Vega cells were located by the following morning. Jisoo handled them without requiring Tae-hyun's direct involvement, which was appropriate, operationally necessary, and strategically clean. The Chong Consortium, when contacted through intermediaries 3 days later, demonstrated a willingness to renegotiate the Eastern Territorial Agreements that suggested they had been informed about what had happened to Vega's sole infrastructure and had adjusted their assessment of where the power sat. Sung Jae was in Jeju by the end of the 48-hour window. Tae-hyun received confirmation of this and did not follow up. There was nothing more to follow up on. The thing that his uncle had been was the thing his uncle had always been, and the version of their relationship that Tae-hyun had believed in had been, he now understood, a thing he had chosen to believe rather than a thing that had been true. Grieving that was different from grieving a person. It was quieter and somehow more persistent, the grief of a particular form of vision rather than a presence. He did not contact Amara for 11 days, not because he had decided not to. There was no decision about it exactly. It was more that he understood, without having to think it through explicitly, that she needed the space to reassemble her life on terms that were her own, without him in the frame, without the weight of everything that had happened attached to every interaction. She had spent 2 years managing a secret that isolated her, and before that a childhood with a father whose love was real and whose reliability was not, and the thing she needed most was probably the experience of days that were simply hers, not shaped by threat, not shaped by debt, not shaped by the gravitational pull of someone else's world. He understood this the way he understood most things that mattered, not through reasoning toward it, but through the simple fact of knowing her face, which he had been studying, in the way he studied faces of consequence, since he had first seen it from 52 floors above. On the 11th day, she texted him. The message said, "I finished the painting." He looked at it for a moment, then typed, "Which one?" Her reply came quickly, "The one that was never right. The eyes." "I finally got the eyes right." He put the phone down, picked it up again, typed, "Can I see it?" A pause, longer than her previous responses. Then, "Yes." He went on a Thursday evening, which was an ordinary evening in November Seoul. Cold, clear, the city in its usual full-tilt momentum, entirely indifferent to the specific weight of the last 2 weeks. He walked from the subway rather than taking the car, because walking required attention in a way that being driven did not. And he found that he wanted the attention, wanted to be inside the ordinary texture of the city rather than moving through it sealed behind glass. Her apartment smelled like paint and tea. The painting was propped against the wall where the unfinished version had stood. The same canvas, now complete. The face was a woman's face, middle-aged, with the specific quality of someone who had spent a long time holding something and had recently set it down. The eyes were right. He could see why she'd said it. There was a clarity in them that the rest of the work had been waiting for, that made the whole painting cohere around the fact of them. "It's your mother," he said. Amara looked at him. "Yes." "You painted her from memory. I called her. We talked for 4 hours. But yes, the painting is from memory." She was standing near the kitchen counter with her hands wrapped around a mug of something hot, and she was wearing her ordinary clothes, jeans, a cream-colored sweater with a small stain near the hem. And she looked, he thought, different from every previous version of how she had looked, including the versions he had found compelling. She looked like a person who had stopped spending energy on the management of danger and had that energy back for other things. It suited her in a way that was almost difficult to look at directly. "How is she?" he said. Shaken, relieved, angry about my father in ways she's been sitting on for 2 years. Amara paused. She knew something was wrong. She didn't know what. She kept asking me to come home, and I kept saying I was fine. She looked at the painting. "She's not angry at me. She said she wishes she'd pushed harder. I told her I was very good at not being pushed." A small pause. She agreed. He sat in the chair near the window. The same chair from the first morning, which had become, without ceremony or announcement, the chair he sat in when he was here. He looked at the painting. "What are you going to do with it?" he said. "Keep it for now. Eventually, I want to show, properly. I've been thinking about it." She said this with the specific quality of someone testing an idea aloud that they have been holding privately, checking its weight against the air. "I've been working. I've been working more than I have since I got here. When there's nothing to be afraid of, it turns out there's a lot of room." He looked at her. "Show me what else you've done." She looked at him for a moment. Then she put down her mug and crossed to the stack of sketchbooks by the window and brought them to the table, and they sat across from each other in the Thursday evening light while she turned pages and he looked at the faces she had made. Strangers from the subway, her colleague from the catering company, the Pojangmacha owner from the street below, rendered with the specific attention of someone who had spent years practicing the art of actually looking. And neither of them said very much, because the sketchbook said the things that needed saying, and the room was warm, and outside Seoul continued its full-tilt, indifferent, beautiful grinding forward in every direction, and neither of them needed it to stop. The art exhibition opened 4 months later. It was a small gallery in Hongdae, not prestigious, not connected, not the kind of venue that generated coverage in the publications that covered prestige venues, but curated by a woman named Song Min-ji, who had been showing emerging artists for 11 years and who had seen Amar's work through a mutual contact and had called her directly and said, without preamble, "I want to show these faces. When can we talk?" Amara had worked for 3 months to prepare the exhibition. 31 pieces, paintings, and large format drawings. All faces, all rendered with the quality that had always been the defining character of her work, which was the quality of having been made by someone who looked without agenda, who saw without the distorting lens of what she expected or wanted to see. They were not sentimental, they were not idealized, they were simply true, in the way that only things made with complete attention to the actual were true. The opening was on a Friday in early March. The gallery was full by 8 p.m. The kind of full that happened when work spoke directly enough to move through word of mouth fast. The room dense with people who had come because someone they trusted had told them to come. Tae-hyun arrived at 8:30. He came alone, not entirely alone because he was never entirely alone. But Jisoo and the others stayed outside, and he walked into the gallery by himself in a plain dark coat with his shoulder fully healed and his face in its default stillness. And he moved through the room without announcing himself to anyone, which was easy because most of the people in the room did not know who he was, and the few who did chose wisely to give him the space he was clearly occupying. He looked at the paintings. He spent time with each one. The middle-aged woman's face, Amara's mother, which he recognized immediately, the eyes he'd already seen finished. A young man on a subway platform caught mid-thought, his face holding something unresolved. An old woman in a market examining produce, with the total focused attention of someone for whom this particular choice still mattered. The Pojangmatcha owner, rendered with a warmth that was entirely unsentimental, entirely earned. A face he recognized as Amara's colleague from the catering company, laughing at something outside the frame. And then, near the back of the gallery, a face he did not recognize for a full 10 seconds. It was a man, mid-30s, sitting near a window with his hands loosely folded, and the city visible behind him as compressed light. His face was in its default stillness, that complete quietude that read, depending on who was looking, as boredom or as the deep interior attention of someone processing something privately. But in Amara's rendering, the stillness was not ambiguous. She had found, in it, something that she had apparently seen from the beginning, a quality that was not coldness and not distance, but the specific look of a person who had spent a very long time inside walls of his own construction and was, in this particular moment, not entirely sure of the walls. The eyes were right. He stood in front of it for a long time. "I almost didn't put it in," Amara said from beside him. He had heard her approach, had been aware of her presence in the room since he arrived, tracking it peripherally the way he tracked significant things, which she had become without announcement or ceremony or any of the formal processes by which significance was usually established. She was wearing a green dress he hadn't seen before, and her hair was up, and she had the specific quality of someone in their own element, grounded, alive, entirely present in the space they occupied. "Why almost?" he said. "Because it's personal." She looked at the painting. "Everything here is personal, but this is personal in a different direction." She paused. "Song Min-ji told me it was the strongest piece in the show. She said it was painted by someone who had looked at the subject for a very long time." She glanced at him sideways. "I told her it was painted from memory." He looked at the painting, at the hands loosely folded, which he recognized, at the city behind the window, which he recognized, at the face, which was his face, and was also something that was not quite his face, was the version of his face that existed in the attention of someone who had been looking at it, quietly and without agenda, for 4 months. "You got the eyes right," he said. "Yes," she said. "I did." They stood together in the back of the gallery while the room moved around them. Glasses raised, voices layered, the particular living noise of people gathered around work that had made them feel something. Outside, through the gallery windows, souls spread in every direction under a March sky that had not yet decided whether to be winter or spring, its lights doing what Soul's lights always did, which was everything at once, relentlessly, without waiting for permission. Amara's hand found his, not dramatically, not with the weight of gesture, just her hand in his hand, warm and specific, the way real things were specific. Not the way things were supposed to feel, but exactly the way they actually felt, which was different and harder and worth every difficult thing that had come before it. He closed his hand around hers. The room continued. The city continued. The lights, indifferent and magnificent, continued. And the feared Korean Mafia boss stood quietly in the back of a small gallery in Hongdae, holding the hand of the woman who had looked at the sky after dropping a tray of champagne and found it funny and understood, not as a revelation, not as anything that required naming aloud, that the thing he had spent 8 years not knowing he needed was not a weakness in the architecture. It was the architecture. It had always been the architecture. It had only needed someone who knew how to look at it correctly to make that visible.